Did Chuck and Jimmy's relationship get destroyed because Chuck was right about Jimmy, or because he was wrong about him? Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad created some of the most interesting characters and relationships TV has ever seen. And to me, one of the most fascinating and tragic relationships in the Breaking Bad universe and in television as a whole is the brotherhood between Jimmy and Chuck McGill. The McGill brothers had quite a memorable and impactful dynamic. They both wrestled between care and cruelty and were willing to take the lowest of blows to best their brother. But even their most cold-hearted acts were born from a place of hurt that dates back to their childhood. So when it comes to Jimmy and Chuck, I believe you can empathize with their origins without apologizing for their actions. And I found myself really wanting to dive deeper into what made this brotherhood so complicated and why it ended so tragically. I figured one of the most effective ways to do that is to first try to understand Chuck. Chuck McGill is such an interesting character. It's crazy how most people in the Breaking Bad universe are corrupt criminals, and yet I walked away feeling like good guy Chuck is one of the most sinister, all while still being sympathetic. I wanted to see what conclusions I'd come to about Jimmy and Chuck's brotherhood if I followed it through Chuck's storyline specifically. Because of course, in a show called Better Call Saul, Jimmy is the main character and the one we follow most and feel for as we watch him evolve into Saul. But I don't think any character is more pivotal to Jimmy's Saul evolution than Chuck McGill. So I watched every single scene with Chuck, especially Chuck and Jimmy, and I took extensive notes because I wanted to really get to the bottom of what went so terribly wrong in Chuck and Jimmy's brotherhood. As it really can be argued that what went wrong between Jimmy and Chuck led to so much else that went wrong in this series and beyond. And with this relationship being such a catalyst, I want to explore all of it. The love, the hate, and why the resentment ultimately won in the end. As I watched each Chuck scene back to back, I aimed to examine what was at the root of Chuck's resentment toward his little brother. Because while it's easy to assume Chuck despised Jimmy for being exactly the unruly screw-up he thought he was, I actually came to a different conclusion. So in this 3-part series, I'm going to go episode by episode through Chuck's journey to uncover what really led to the downfall of the brothers McGill, and why their relationship was always so intriguing, so complicated, and so doomed. Starting with season 1, where by the end of the season, Chuck finally says what he's really been feeling all along, and it changes the way you see everything that came before it. And before deep diving into the complex, compelling, and at times downright cruel brotherhood of Chuck and Jimmy McGill, I first want to point out that one of the cool things about reflecting on a series as a complete body of work is that you get to see how all the scenes aligned in ways both intentional by the creators and unintentional. I like to believe that stories that are meant to be told have a way of telling themselves, unfolding in a very organic way and encouraging interpretation. Sometimes there could be a detail that wasn't necessarily planted from the beginning by the writers, but still paid off perfectly in the end. I say that to say I'm not suggesting that everything I pinpoint in this deep dive was intentionally planned, though a lot of it was by these talented writers. But I do think these details all wound up being extra effective in retrospect. So here are my 95 insights about the brothers McGill in season 1, the beginning of Jimmy and Chuck's downfall.
I'm going to get better!
For their first scene together, Jimmy grounds himself and delivers items to Chuck's home. Jimmy has to remove any electronics and place them in the mailbox before entering Chuck's home, which reads like entering a prison. I found it interesting that throughout the entire series, the show almost always makes it a point to show people leaving their electronics in the mailbox when entering Chuck's home and picking them back up from the mailbox when they leave. Like they almost never skip showing those two actions, and it really makes it seem like this home has the same processing as a prison, which is fitting since Chuck's home really is like his prison and a reflection of his mental prison. And as we're introduced to Chuck's condition in this scene, I also like how Chuck's electromagnetic hypersensitivity is just one of the many ways that Chuck has an unhealthy relationship with power. In retrospect, there's something very tragic about how lighting a lantern is the first thing Jimmy does in Chuck's home, now knowing what a lantern will cause in Chuck's final moments. It's clear that tending to Chuck and doing so in the dark isn't the most convenient, but Jimmy is willing to do it anyway because he loves his brother. And we learn a lot from Jimmy and Chuck's first interaction. Chuck holds up a finger to silence Jimmy when he greets him, more preoccupied with his work. And he tells Jimmy his arrival is perfect timing, not because now they can enjoy each other's company, but because now he can have Jimmy deliver his paper for him. Work he infers is so simple, a student can do it. It's like Chuck is treating Jimmy as though he's still in the mailroom, and Jimmy has to remind him that he's trying to start a legal practice. But Chuck brushes past that comment, and while he brushes past it cordially, Jimmy starting a legal practice really is the bane of Chuck's existence. And I think there's many reasons for that, which we'll examine here, but at least part of his disdain is because for so long, the law was Chuck's terrain, where he got to flourish all to himself and not have to share it with Jimmy. When Jimmy asks if they can just talk, Chuck raises his lantern, and his first concern is if Jimmy is alright, as he thinks he looks peaked. But then, when it's not that, his immediate next assumption is that Jimmy may be in trouble, as clearly he's accustomed to Jimmy getting in trouble often. Interestingly, in their flashback in the series finale, Chuck is the one who wants to talk, and Jimmy is the one evading a heart-to-heart. These brothers rarely ever could get on the same page at the same time. When making his case for why he shouldn't cash out, Chuck says,
In order to pay out my share, suppose my partners are forced to liquidate the firm.
And that's exactly what Chuck is willing to do by the end, showing how far he's strayed. At the moment, Chuck seems to be taking a thoughtful approach about how everyone at every level of HHM will be negatively impacted if he takes a payout. But those people at HHM are mostly just devices for making his case, because whenever it benefits him, Chuck's willing to put HHM at risk of shutting down and do whatever to protect his ego. Chuck laughs when Jimmy thinks he has to provide for him and cover for him. It's clear the idea that Jimmy thinks Chuck needs him in any meaningful way gets under his skin. The sound of the ticking clock in the back is a nice touch, as on a technical side, it serves as another reminder that Chuck uses old-fashioned items that don't require electricity, but the constant ticking also makes it feel like the two brothers are inside a ticking time bomb, with tension that's bound to explode at some point. When Chuck presents that Howard wants Jimmy to not practice law with his own name, Jimmy says,
That's my name, I was born with it.
And Chuck resents that Jimmy was, in fact, born with the McGill name, but didn't seem to inherit the inherent goodness that he believes is supposed to come with being a McGill. When first introduced to him, it's easy to read Chuck as someone just trying to protect the law from a wild card like Jimmy, but the more you look at these early moments, it becomes clear there's much more behind his motives.
Take off the space blanket, Chuck.
In episode 2, a lantern is yet again prominent in Chuck's scene this episode, and it now feels ominous on a rewatch. Jimmy enters the home drunk and undresses as he goes to sleep after the ordeal he had with Tuco. It's interesting that in his state of disarray after Tuco, Jimmy had the taxi bring him to Chuck's instead of his own place. He didn't want to be alone, he wanted to be with family, and flaws and all, Jimmy still believes at this point that he can turn to Chuck as family. Chuck isn't too bothered by Jimmy showing up and even places a blanket over him. It was important to see these moments of Chuck showing some signs of non-performative nurture and care toward Jimmy, because it indicates that his brother does matter to him in some capacity. This early in the season, Chuck and Jimmy both allow themselves to be inconvenienced by their brother, which could suggest that some form of love really is at the foundation of this relationship. Then, Chuck starts to react as though he can sense electricity in the vicinity, and sure enough, when he checks Jimmy's pants, he finds his cell phone. I like how when Chuck finds the cell phone, the music that plays is menacing, as if he found a dangerous robber in the home. The show used a lot of music and visual cues to make Chuck's hypersensitivity feel as daunting to us as it is to him. It shows how a reaction to something can manipulate reality. Jimmy wakes up from his drunken sleep to see Chuck across from him in a space blanket. The image of these two brothers in this disheveled state is interesting because Jimmy is rattled by being pulled into the drug game, and Chuck is rattled by the mental shackles of thinking he's allergic to electricity. Both have become attached to something detrimental. Jimmy is adamant that Chuck take off the space blanket, emphasizing that he didn't do anything wrong. While Chuck sees the space blanket as something that helps him against his allergy, Jimmy sees it as an external sign that Chuck isn't well mentally, and he wants to see his brother strong. Unlike Chuck, who would prefer to see Jimmy always reaching for success without ever actually obtaining it, Jimmy seems to genuinely root for and believe in Chuck getting better and being the best he can be. And since Jimmy deep down knows the electromagnetic hypersensitivity is in Chuck's head, seeing Chuck in the space blanket makes him feel guilty, like he caused his brother to spiral, not the cell phone. When Chuck asks why take off the space blanket, Jimmy just reiterates that he needs to take off the space blanket, perhaps wanting to show Chuck that he doesn't actually need it, and also to bring Jimmy some comfort that Chuck hasn't lost complete control of his mental fortitude. Chuck appeases him and takes off the blanket, however the second Jimmy leaves, he wraps himself back in the blanket. It's one of the negatives of Chuck thinking he's always right. He's convinced he's right about his allergy and that the space blanket helps, and he won't accept any other perspective. His mental allergy to electricity emphasizes how, when something feels real to you, you can make it real in reality. And if Chuck could convince himself he's allergic to electricity, he could have convinced himself Jimmy wasn't perpetually slipping Jimmy, but he didn't want to see it any other way.
Here's Johnny.
Better Call Saul is often very intentional about their opening images for episodes. And if Chuck's home didn't feel like a prison before, then starting episode 3 with people removing their phones and belongings at an actual jail really solidifies the parallel. The episode opens with a flashback as Chuck pays a visit to Jimmy in jail. Seeing Jimmy in an orange jumpsuit makes it even clearer why he ended up working so well with criminal clientele as Saul Goodman. He gets them because he is them. And the visual of Chuck in his stiff suit and tie and Jimmy in his orange jail suit illustrate how the two brothers took very different paths in life. Chuck has such a dark and resentful look at Jimmy when Jimmy urges him to work his magic and make his problems go poof. The last thing Chuck wants is for his skill and success as a lawyer to yet again enable and coddle his baby brother. As Jimmy tries to strategize with a silent Chuck, who communicates mostly with peeved facial expressions under the guise of being calm, Jimmy says,
I know you got a million legal loopholes that we can dance through. Big bag of tricks. You know, any clever technicalities, huh?
It's interesting how Jimmy's first instinct is to figure out how they can bend rules and trick the system rather than go about his case in an above-board manner. It shows how he's always viewed the law as malleable and how legal loopholes and tricks will be his own method going forward when he becomes a lawyer. Contrasting Jimmy's attempt at chumminess with his brother, Chuck reveals he and Jimmy actually haven't seen each other in 5 years in this flashback, with Chuck in Albuquerque and Jimmy in Chicago. And he phrases it as Jimmy not reaching out to them rather than viewing the lack of contact as two-sided. Chuck makes the conversation about family as he says Jimmy couldn't even call himself and instead had their mother call him. It implies the only reason Chuck agreed to go meet with Jimmy in Cook County Jail is that his mother wanted him to, and he was eager to please his mom, not save Jimmy. Chuck felt Jimmy deserved to face the consequences of his Chicago sunroof ordeal. But once again, his parents wanted their precious Jimmy to evade consequences, and Chuck was expected to oblige, adding more fuel to his resentment. As an older sibling with a notable age gap, it'd be fair to say Chuck was probably put in many scenarios throughout his life where he had to be the responsible one and clean up after Jimmy's messes. And while saving Jimmy has become a core part of his identity, it's still something he resents. Chuck calls Jimmy out, questioning,
You didn't cry and beg Mom for help.
That further solidifies that Chuck is here to do their mother a favor because he's making their conversation personal when Jimmy wants to strategize. This is our earliest insight of their mother, who always holds a lot of unspoken weight between these two brothers. I get the sense that without their mom and dad wanting the boys to remain connected, Jimmy and Chuck would have drifted apart for good by now. Unlike Chuck, Jimmy admits his shortcomings when he says,
I'm a lousy brother, I'm a big screw-up. And if I was just a better person, I would not only stop letting you down, you know what? I'd stop letting me down.
It seems sincere, and I think part of it is. But Jimmy is also a good talker who knows the right things to say to get out of a pickle. He'll take the self-depreciating angle if it means getting what he wants. And little does he know, the part of him that does sincerely desire to make Chuck proud will actually be destructive, because Chuck is much more comfortable pitying Jimmy than being proud of him. Chuck is about to end the visit, mostly unmoved by Jimmy's words, but Jimmy stops him, saying his life will be over without Chuck getting him out of this. Chuck wants to make sure Jimmy understands that, and also says if he helps Jimmy, he better not make a fool out of him. And tragically, Jimmy will go on to make such a big fool out of Chuck that he'll never truly recover, and it'll contribute to Chuck eventually feeling like his life is over.
If there's one thing kids love, it's local print journalism.
This scene in Hero starts with Jimmy pulling up to Chuck's house and a newspaper's on the ground. I like how it's shot with a newspaper in the foreground, making it seem larger and looming because Jimmy knows if Chuck sees this paper, it'll cause tension. When Jimmy picks it up, he sees a big headline declaring him a local hero after the billboard incident he orchestrated. Similar to his scheme in the pilot, Jimmy puppeteers scenarios that make him look like a good guy. From planning to come to Mrs. Kettleman's rescue with the hit-and-run scheme, to looking like he valiantly saved a man from falling to his death. While Jimmy can get Minnie to fall for his act, Jimmy's sure that if Chuck were to see his billboard rescue in the paper, he'd know slipping Jimmy antics were involved. So instead, Jimmy doesn't bring the newspaper inside and just tells Chuck that things are looking up for him as he's got more new clients. Chuck responds happy for Jimmy and asks what he credits this sudden change in traction to. And Jimmy says,
Well, you told me to keep plugging and, do good work and the clients will come.
And that's the thing, Jimmy/Saul is very good at doing shady work with full commitment. And sure enough, the criminal clients come. Jimmy and Chuck are both lying to each other in this scene. Jimmy lies about the way he acquired these clients and about why he didn't bring over the Albuquerque Journal. And Chuck says he knew Jimmy had it in him to live a clean, law-abiding lifestyle and succeed as a lawyer, which he didn't and doesn't believe. As Jimmy heads out, Chuck says,
Good luck today.
Thanks.
Keep it up. Hard work looks good on you.
And I noticed how on a first watch of early season 1, you really could believe that while Jimmy and Chuck are very different people, maybe they are genuinely a support system for each other. But in retrospect, you see how a lot of their niceties, especially Chuck's, masked the darker issues between them. The second Jimmy leaves, Chuck sees newspapers in people's driveways and knows something is fishy. And he's so eager to figure it out that he wraps himself in a space blanket and bears the pain of the electromagnetic fields outdoors to nab a neighbor's newspaper. But not without also leaving the neighbor money, as Chuck aims to steal the paper in a way that still fits within his moral code. I always really like how the sounds and sights of Chuck leaving his his home to take the newspaper make it seem like something really intense and excruciating is happening. And then you see Chuck running from the neighbor's perspective through the window, and it just seems like a madman overreacting. Another example of the power of perspective. Chuck reads the Albuquerque front page despite having tons of other reading he could have done, and he sees the news of Jimmy's heroic rescue. He also sees the billboard clearly mocking AJ Jim, and then the episode ends with Chuck further wrapping himself in the space blanket, as it's clear Jimmy and his antics exacerbate his illness more than electricity. And you're meant to think it's the slipping Jimmy aspect that bothers Chuck most, but in retrospect, I see that it's the lawyer aspect, and the way his little brother is always praised no matter what he does that gets under Chuck's skin the most. Because if Chuck's issue was really just slipping Jimmy, then Jimmy trying to do things the right way should make things better, but instead, it'll make things so much worse.
You think I'm crazy?
Unfortunately, Chuck stole a paper from a neighbor who does not play about her print journalism, and so she called the police on him. And when the police come knocking on Chuck's door, he gets up and the camera shot makes a point to show Chuck stepping on the newspaper, which shows just how low he views Jimmy's heroic moment. The police want to come in, but Chuck uses lawyer talk to delay them. Chuck really is never opposed to using his dense knowledge of the law as a defense mechanism. The police look inside Chuck's home and see wires yanked out of a breaker box and a whole lot of camp stove fuel, which leads them to view Chuck as a tweaker. Again, the power of perception. Chuck aims to seem like the most polished person in the world, but from a different viewpoint, he can appear like the opposite. So the police kick down the door and Chuck is confronted with blinding light and tasers, a nightmare for him in his illness. The next scene opens with a close-up of Chuck's eye looking directly at the bright light in the hospital room. Chuck is in a dissociative state as Jimmy calls out to him. His hands are also tied up, similar to how Jimmy's were tied up in cuffs previously. More imagery that can reflect how the law-abiding Chuck is still in a prison of his own. And then Jimmy proceeds to turn off all the electricity and is upset with the doctors for surrounding him with it. Even if Jimmy thinks the illness isn't real, he defends or perhaps enables his brother by declaring to the doctor that he's allergic to electricity. Jimmy asked the doctors why they didn't call him, and instead he had to find out Chuck had been hospitalized from Chuck's
Prick of a law partner.
There's something sad but fitting when the doctor explains the only contact info they had from Chuck was a business card. Chuck made business his life, and so it's the only thing by which he can be identified. When the doctor suggests that Chuck be admitted to a psychiatric ward, Chuck finally chimes in, saying he'd rather not do that. He also shows he heard their conversation when he refutes the doctor's claim that he was incoherent. When the doctor asks if he knows why he's here, he doesn't say because he had an episode, but rather because the police acted rashly toward him. It seems Chuck can always find someone else to blame for his situation. Chuck prefers to call his situation a condition, electromagnetic hypersensitivity, and he says it occurred for reasons unknown, but it's telling that his EHS started after his divorce. Rebecca left and took the light with her, it seems. As Chuck explains his symptoms to the doctor, Jimmy sums it up more succinctly by saying,
It hurts.
and he seems sincere. Jimmy knows that whether it's mental or physical, what matters is that what Chuck is going through hurts him, and that makes Jimmy feel for him. When the doctor is persistent about treating this as something mental, not physical, Chuck uses his knowledge of the law to make a case for why he shouldn't be treated as though he has a mental illness. And Jimmy is so on Chuck's side against the doctor. Even when the doctor exposes that Chuck is fine when she turns some electricity on, Jimmy calls it a dirty trick. It makes me think Jimmy is trying to overcompensate and make up for the times Chuck bailed him out of his own tough situations. A notable line from Dr. Cruz is,
This allergy to electricity isn't real. It's a manifestation of something deeper.
and what is that something deeper? I think it's a manifestation of Chuck's marriage failing and Jimmy getting his law degree. Things that make him feel less in control and challenge Chuck's beliefs. And rather than deal with what unsettles him about those things, he begins to chalk up his internal issues to external electricity grating on him. Jimmy acknowledges that the illness may not be 100% real, but says Chuck is smarter than all of them, so they aren't talking him out of it. He also defends himself as Chuck's caretaker. Perhaps Jimmy liked feeling needed by Chuck for once, as it's only in this vulnerable state that Chuck would ever even remotely lean on his little brother. Even when Jimmy is about to talk with the doctor, Chuck sounds like a little kid telling Jimmy he wants to go home and needing Jimmy's help to do so. Dr. Cruz speaks with Jimmy and questions, is that helping or enabling? It's a fair question, as even Jimmy's brotherly care and loyalty has a potentially negative impact. That's yet another reason the electricity allergy was an effective choice for the show. Had Jimmy just been catering to his brother while he battled cancer or a confirmed illness, he'd seem like a saint. But catering to a brother whose condition is largely imagined is problematic. It also was effective to give Chuck, a man who wants to believe life is black and white, a condition that could be linked to mental illness, as many mental illnesses don't often fit neatly into one easily labeled box. The doctor predicts Chuck's demise when she defends that he is a danger to himself and could burn his house down. She presents the idea that he could hurt himself in a household accident and be unable to call for help. She says Jimmy has the power to essentially help his brother overcome his aversion to power and warns, ignoring this won't make it go away. But Jimmy and Chuck have spent years ignoring what's really going on inside of them, so instead, Jimmy helps bring Chuck home. Once home, Chuck says he'll need his space blanket, and despite Jimmy clearly not liking the space blanket, he gives it to him, making it clear that he really is enabling the behavior. Jimmy draws some correct conclusions when he tells Chuck he thinks he got sick because he saw the billboard story in the paper.
Whenever you think I've done something wrong, something questionable, you get worse.
Chuck so badly wants to believe it's external things causing an external illness, when both the cause and effect are much more likely internal. Jimmy says,
You think this is the return of Slippin' Jimmy, but it's not.
he thinks Slipping Jimmy is at the root of Chuck being unwell. But one of the things that makes Chuck even more unwell is Jimmy working as a lawyer. He can deal with Slipping Jimmy, not lawyer Jimmy. Hence why when Jimmy tries to assure him in this scene that he has been getting business, Chuck winces like it hurts to hear. He winces again when Jimmy says, I'm a good lawyer. This is at the root of what irritates Chuck, not the electricity. When Jimmy defends the billboard as mere advertising, Chuck notes these advertising methods weren't allowed until a Supreme Court ruling that he disagrees with changed it. But he's had to accept that it's legal now because that's the thing with the law. It's concrete until it's not, which is tough for someone like Chuck who wants to believe certain things are set in stone. It's interesting that when Jimmy says he's starting to specialize in elder law, he repeats Kim's words verbatim about why elders need someone looking out for them. Kim expressed the sentiment from the heart in the nail salon, whereas Jimmy expresses it more to appease Chuck, as pretty much everything he does is to get Chuck's approval. Jimmy tries to say Slipping Jimmy is dead and buried and that he will be good as a lawyer. He thinks that's what Chuck wants to hear, but it's not. So long as Jimmy is a lawyer, it'll never be good to Chuck. And Chuck really doesn't believe Jimmy has it in him to be consistently good as a person either, so he just responds, we'll see. And the thing is, Chuck ended up being right that Jimmy wouldn't take a good path. But perhaps it was Chuck's very belief that he wouldn't that caused that.
That does not sound like a real thing.
This scene in Bingo begins with Jimmy pulling up to the house with a zoomed-in shot of a caterpillar half in its cocoon. Of course, it could just be there, but I like to think in a thoughtfully crafted show like Better Call Saul, there's always meaning to be gleaned, even if just your own interpretation. And the shot of this caterpillar only half in its cocoon, to me suggests that Jimmy is in the middle of building the cocoon that will have him evolving into Saul Goodman by the end of the series. And where is that cocoon being built? In Chuck's home, the very place where the makings of Saul Goodman also substantially developed. When Jimmy enters the home, he finds that Chuck is outside trying to build up his tolerance for electromagnetic fields. Chuck likens it to taking small doses of poison to build up an immunity, and in a way, Jimmy dipping his toe further and further into the world of crime is him taking small doses of poison and building up an immunity to it too. Plus, with the way Chuck views Jimmy as a poison to the legal field, it's like Chuck subconsciously forcing himself to build up a tolerance to that too, since Jimmy still hasn't changed his mind about being a lawyer. Jimmy says he's proud of Chuck's commitment to get better, and I think he is the one McGill who actually is sincerely proud of his brother. Then Jimmy brings in boxes from his elder cases, and Chuck is hesitant about it, but Jimmy claims he just needs the storage space. Jimmy speaks and says the code wrong, saying he needs to file 413s, and Chuck corrects that it's 513s. And as we know, number mix-ups will carry real weight going forward. Chuck looks at the boxes of files like they're calling his name, and sure enough, he takes one of the files and looks into it. And then Jimmy watches him from the window as it's revealed that it was his plan all along to entice Chuck into doing the work. And once again, it's a morally gray area. Did Jimmy want to inspire Chuck to get back to doing the legal work he enjoys? Or did he want to offload his work to Chuck so he didn't have to do it himself? The trouble is, it's probably both. But again, Chuck doesn't tend to see both as options. It's usually black or white, this or that for him. It's probably part of why Chuck liked the law, because when a verdict is issued, it's a final conclusion. And where Jimmy operates in the gray, Chuck finds comfort in the illusion of black and white finality.
Or we'll see you in court.
It feels fitting to start the first flashback of Jimmy in the mailroom with the metal cart he's pushing. Something about it feels like prison bars to me, as if this is Jimmy's form of incarceration. The first person Jimmy shows his law acceptance letter to is Kim, who's super supportive and happy for him, in juxtaposition to Chuck. When Jimmy enters Chuck's office, their framing is similar to their first scene in the pilot, making the relationship feel quite cyclical. Chuck is at his desk, preoccupied with work, except here he uses electricity comfortably. The show could have had him in some super bright office for contrast, but I feel like having the office be similarly dark and shadowy helps indicate that the issues with Chuck were long-standing and his darkness existed before he decided he was allergic to electricity. The first thing Chuck says when he learns Jimmy passed the bar is,
Is this a joke?
You could think it's just because he's surprised, but as he'll later reveal, Chuck thinks Jimmy being a lawyer really is a sick joke. Chuck reads Jimmy's acceptance letter in shock. He views the law as sacred, and someone as wayward as Jimmy taints the purity of the law merely by being a part of it to Chuck. Jimmy is so eager to have Chuck's approval in this exchange, and through Jimmy's dialogue, it's clear that he really did put hard work into passing the bar. He didn't cut corners. He chose a correspondence school that allowed him to keep his job in the mailroom. He took night courses. He failed the bar twice but kept trying, and he did all this without telling Chuck or asking Chuck for help, which makes this victory truly his own. And I think that's what threatens Chuck more than anything. Because again, he's fine with Jimmy being under him, but Jimmy succeeding without Chuck and doing anything that could level the playing field between them always bothers the eldest McGill. Chuck even notices in this scene that this must have taken years and asks why Jimmy didn't come to him for help, likely deep down thinking, why didn't you tell me about this so I could stop it from happening? But Jimmy reaching this achievement all on his own shows he was becoming more independent, serious, and savvy than Chuck bargained for. Chuck wanted Jimmy to stop committing crimes. He didn't want him to elevate to the point of now potentially fighting crime as a lawyer. McKean does some great acting when Jimmy so earnestly asks, "Are you proud of me?" And Chuck's initial response is, Then he stutters over his words as he says a forced, enthused, "Yes, absolutely." And Jimmy's response is much more sincere as he says,
Thanks, Chuck, that means a lot.
Jimmy says if Chuck thinks it's appropriate, maybe he will consider hiring him, and Chuck again exposes his real feelings as he asks,
Is what?
before quickly correcting and remembering it would be as a lawyer. Chuck tells Jimmy he'd have to talk with the partner since it's not only his decision, and yet it was completely Chuck's decision-making that kept Jimmy from working at HHM. There's always something pretty sad about the next scene being Jimmy celebrating his win with people who actually like and support him, and then Howard entering his party and asking to speak to Jimmy alone to tell him they won't be hiring him at HHM. A rejection we and Jimmy will soon learn was completely orchestrated by Chuck. Now, having learned that Sandpiper may be taking advantage of their clients, Jimmy is ready to move on from the Wills and get Chuck's insight on something else, even with Chuck beckoning Jimmy to stand on his own 2 feet, which is ironic because one of the things that most upset Chuck was Jimmy standing on his own 2 feet and becoming a lawyer. But this scene makes it seem like there could be hope for Jimmy and Chuck as they both agree that Sandpiper may be committing fraud. After seeing Jimmy willing to do the tedious work of piecing together shredded documents, we get a clear sense of how differently Chuck and Jimmy view what Jimmy does. Jimmy is committedly getting documents together to make a solid case, but Chuck sees it as,
Broke into a nursing home
Assisted living.
and you stole their garbage.
Jimmy reminds him that everything he did is above the belt legal, and Chuck can't deny that, even if he doesn't think it was respectable. It just made me think about how legal doesn't always equate good or ethical, and I think Jimmy being in the legal field forces Chuck to confront the looseness of the legal system he's dedicated his life to. This really is probably Jimmy and Chuck at their most brotherly, as Chuck lets Jimmy sort through the shredded papers in his home and says he doesn't mind the company as he makes the 2 coffee. Then, when he finds Jimmy knocked out on the floor, he's nurturing as he gives him a pillow to sleep on. When Jimmy wakes up, Chuck has pieced together all the documents, found their smoking gun, and starts talking about the next steps they need to take with the case. He speaks in terms of us, which is what most stands out to Jimmy. It's a nice moment when Jimmy asks,
We're working together on this?
and Chuck says,
That's up to you, Jimmy.
and Jimmy looks as happy as a kid on Christmas morning. But in retrospect, this marks the beginning of the end for these brothers. Chuck smiles and seems sincere as he extends his hand for a handshake, seeming to show Jimmy some respect as his partner. And then Jimmy instead pulls him in for a hug. The contrast of the handshake and the hug shows how, for Jimmy, this isn't just a great development between lawyers, but between brothers. And Chuck thinking he's good enough to work with means everything to Jimmy. But then in the hug, Chuck's coldness comes through again as he seems annoyed by the embrace and says, "Let's get to work," as the case excites Chuck, not partnering with Jimmy. Then Chuck has a vulnerable moment when he's unsure if he can jump right into lawyering during the Sandpiper meeting. But Jimmy hypes him up. It's another moment of Chuck needing Jimmy more than he'd care to admit. During this meeting, Chuck isn't on his game, which requires Jimmy to step up. And he does. Jimmy was great, confident, and knowledgeable while still being himself when he faced off with the Sandpiper lawyers. It felt like the closest we'll ever come to seeing Saul Goodman and Chuck working together. And then once the Sandpiper lawyers are gone and it's just Jimmy and Chuck, Jimmy goes right back to deferring to his big brother as Chuck takes the lead. The episode ends with a moment of Chuck being so caught up in the paperwork of the case that he doesn't even notice how effortlessly he steps outside, touches a cell phone, opens the car, and grabs the boxes from Jimmy's trunk. Perhaps it should have been an indicator to Chuck that working with Jimmy rather than against him makes him get better, as the shackles of his alleged allergy went away in this rare moment of Chuck not pushing against Jimmy as a lawyer, but accepting it and working with him. For a moment here, it almost feels like this may actually work, like Chuck and Jimmy might actually be healing and finally be on the same side. But that's what makes what comes next such a gut punch.
You didn't want me.
This very important episode fades in with a great shot of Jimmy and Chuck on the bench outside and facing away from the camera. It's a moving image too, considering these brothers haven't been able to enjoy being outside together like this in years. Chuck focuses up on the wires above them, and Jimmy helps him out, saying not to worry about the wires and instead look down at the grass. Jimmy already has his shoes off, and he encourages Chuck to do the same and take his shoes off and feel the grass beneath his feet, as it's been ages since he's let go and done that. Chuck listens, and the way Jimmy watches Chuck take off his shoes to feel the grass between his toes shows that he really is cherishing this moment with his brother. The scene reminds us that both Chuck and Jimmy have strengths to offer each other. Chuck exemplifies structure, which is important, and Jimmy exemplifies moving more freely, which is also important. They could have helped each other develop a more whole way of being had they not viewed the other's differences as weaknesses rather than strengths. Then, it's a small detail, but I like the visual of the two walking back to the house, with Chuck having put his shoes back on while Jimmy remains barefoot. It visually emphasizes how Chuck still has a guard up in this partnership, covering his true motives and feelings, while Jimmy is more bare and vulnerable with his brother. It also reflects their personalities, with the straight-laced one and the free-spirited one. When Chuck explains that Schweikart and Coakley sent over tons of boxes of paperwork, Jimmy refuses to get overwhelmed, and his immediate response is,
"We can deal with this."
Chuck suggests they refer the case to H.A. Jim, and Jimmy clearly hates the idea, pleading with Chuck that they can do this and they're doing great on their own and don't need Hamlin or anyone else. That shows it's not even about his disdain for Howard, he just really wants this to be a Brothers McGill assignment. As Jimmy gets up to leave, agreeing to bring H.H.M. in, Chuck extends his hand for another handshake, and last time Jimmy wrapped him in an embrace instead. But this time, he dejectedly shakes Chuck's hand, and it feels like a visual way to show how Jimmy has been forced back into a strictly business role with Chuck. The dagger, though, is when Jimmy says,
"I guess I'll have to get an office right next to yours." Finally out of the mailroom.
and Chuck hearing that upsets him so much that the whirring sound increases. Jimmy's rise in the ranks as a lawyer, and especially as an H.H.M. lawyer, is his truest sensitivity. He's convinced Hamlin McGill should only ever allow for one McGill. And letting Jimmy break past that ceiling to be a part of something Chuck built and holds dear is something Chuck was never going to let happen. So while Jimmy sleeps in Chuck's home, Chuck sneaks outside to use Jimmy's phone to make a call to Howard instead of his plan to reject Jimmy being a part of H.H.M. Again. He's willing to bear through his allergy and abandon his morality to lie and stop Jimmy. It's sad how Jimmy was so sincere in supporting Chuck being outside at the beginning of the episode, and now Chuck goes outside to screw Jimmy over. The sequence of it feels similar to Jimmy's betrayal next season, doing something shady while Chuck sleeps. Then Jimmy and Chuck exhibit teamwork as they prepare to go to H.H.M. Jimmy reassures Chuck that he can do this and checks to make sure he's comfortable. He even did the thoughtful thing of lining Chuck's blazer with the space blanket material. It's important to see this scene as we see Jimmy showing up sincerely and with real care, all while Chuck knows he's about to crush Jimmy when he's denied working for H.H.M. Chuck is greeted like a king entering his palace when he steps into H.H.M., and Jimmy stands beside him, getting a view of what it's like to be respected at the highest level, something he craves. But as everyone greets Chuck and escorts him upstairs, no one pays any mind to Jimmy, who was the one who found this case, except Kim, who stays with Jimmy and even helps by taking up a box. During the meeting, it's deja vu for Jimmy when he asks for an office right next to Chuck's, and Howard asks to have the room just like he did when Jimmy was having his party in the break room in the flashback. And when left alone, Howard says they won't be bringing Jimmy on as a lawyer. Chuck is really trying to pull out his acting chops when he reacts in shock to Howard saying they don't want Jimmy, they only want the case, knowing he orchestrated the situation all along. In this moment, it feels like Howard is to Chuck what Marco is to Jimmy. They're both in on the scheme, playing their designated role to make things appear in a way that it isn't. Ruses are easier to sell when you have one person acting like they aren't in on it. So Chuck is pretending to be as shocked and disappointed as Jimmy, and Howard is playing along and allowing himself to be the bad guy, while Jimmy is none the wiser. Normally, Jimmy would pick up on tactics like this, but he clearly wants to trust his brother so much that he doesn't even consider he's getting played by Chuck in this meeting. Jimmy figures out he's been duped when he realizes Chuck used his phone to call Howard. Meanwhile, Chuck is whistling and chipper in his home, knowing he blocked Jimmy from being a working lawyer at H.H.M. Knowing he's kept Jimmy below where he feels he belongs, he's more willing to give Jimmy his props when Jimmy shows up to the house, as he tells his baby bro the space blanket in his jacket was a fantastic idea. Jimmy says,
Two McGill boys, side by side, storming the gates, righting wrongs, taking down the bad guys, and making a boatload of money to boot. That would have been great, right?
And then Chuck replies,
The very best.
and it even more confirms his willingness to lie through his teeth to Jimmy. There's some superb acting from Odenkirk as he drops the act and reveals to Chuck that he knows what he did. And Chuck's expression becomes much darker and colder once exposed. He almost looks like a classic villain when they no longer hold up their innocent facade. Up to this point, Chuck has kept his real feelings just beneath the surface. But it's now bubbling to the top, and then in this next moment, it spills over and changes everything as Chuck finally stops holding back.
Why were you working against me, Chuck?
Chuck's response to that question is pivotal to the series.
Not a real lawyer.
And he doubles down on it, saying it again with more bass in his voice. Chuck craps on Jimmy's degree and online courses, saying,
What a joke.
Then he raises his voice as he screams about how hard he worked and how Jimmy takes shortcuts and thinks suddenly he's Chuck's peer. That's what especially grates on him, being equal with Jimmy.
You do what I do because you're funny and you can make people laugh.
What Chuck says here feels deeply connected to their childhood. As McKean said of Chuck and Jimmy regarding their mother, Chuck makes their mom proud, but Jimmy makes their mom laugh. And both things are equal in value to her, even if they aren't to Chuck. Jimmy sounds wounded when he says,
I thought you were proud of me.
He made the mistake of thinking Chuck wanted him to succeed past a certain ceiling of success. But Chuck reveals he was really only proud of Jimmy when he worked in the mailroom where Chuck felt he belonged. Chuck says,
People don't change. You're slipping Jimmy.
And that's exactly Chuck's problem. He thinks what he knows is absolute. He thinks what people are can't be changed. So he's convinced Jimmy is forever destined to be slipping Jimmy, and it causes him to overlook all the ways Jimmy tried to improve. Even with getting his degree, it didn't sound like Jimmy took any unjust shortcuts, but it doesn't matter because nothing Jimmy did would ever be legitimate in Chuck's eyes.
And slipping Jimmy I can handle just fine, but slipping Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun.
It's tragic that as Chuck yells, the law is sacred. If you abuse that power, people get hurt. He can't see how deeply he's currently hurting his brother right here and now. Jimmy looks truly pained in this moment, but it's like because Chuck thinks that what he's saying is correct, he's blind to the many other legal ways you can cause harm.
I know you know I'm right. You know I'm right.
All Chuck seems to prioritize is being right, as if being right automatically equates being good, when the way he's behaving in this scene proves that's not true. Jimmy responds by saying he got Chuck a good amount of the grocery items he needs, and it'll be his last haul for Chuck. He tells Chuck he's on his own after this and he's done helping. These are things he did out of love for his brother, but in this moment, it's like it's sinking in that his brother didn't fully love him back. Chuck thinks Jimmy moving on up in life as a lawyer is an affront to him, when really, it could have been viewed as the power of his positive influence. Jimmy wasn't trying to take Chuck's spot or be above him, he wanted them to work together and be equals. He wanted to follow in the footsteps of the brother he admires. But Chuck doesn't know who he is if he's not above Jimmy, so being equals threatens his identity.
Jimmy!
After their damning conversation in episode 9, Chuck doesn't appear in the season 1 finale. But it is interesting that Jimmy goes right back to his old Slippin' Jimmy territory when he visits Marco in this episode. It's like realizing how Chuck really feels about him makes Jimmy feel there's no point in trying to change, so he just goes back to his roots. And Marco has a revealing opinion of Chuck saying, "You just got out of jail, you want to go back?" when he learns Jimmy is going to work for Chuck in a flashback. And then says,
You're slipping Jimmy. What do you gotta change, huh?
It's a more positive spin on the idea that maybe Jimmy can't change his ways, but maybe that's not a bad thing to some people. And then in the present, Marco tells Jimmy,
Chuck's a stuck-up douchebag. I hate to break it to you, but he doesn't even like you.
and I think Marco is right. Chuck has love for Jimmy, but he doesn't like him. He revealed as much at the end of this season, and his real feelings towards Jimmy only get more and more exposed in season 2. Chuck took a swing at Jimmy in season 1 with his harsh words and behind-the-back tactics. And next season, we'll see just how Jimmy swings back, as this not-so-brotherly rivalry heats up.